You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, let's talk about the prospect of Donald Trump's DC trial getting televised. Now, first of all, Judge Chutkan has solicited briefs from both the DOJ and Trump's team. But if it's against federal court rules to televise a trial, does she actually have the power to make this happen?
You know, Brian, it looks like she doesn't. If you look at Federal Rule 53, it says cameras are prohibited from the courtroom unless there is a new law passed or there is a change to the federal rules. Neither of those two things has happened. It doesn't look like either of those two things will happen anytime soon. There's still a little sliver of hope because there's an organization called the U.S. Judicial Conference that is headed up by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts. They can actually grant an exception to Rule 53 if they choose, and they could allow cameras in the courtroom. Of course, all of the recent reporting indicates that they are not interested in doing that. So it really becomes an academic exercise with Donald Trump's lawyers filing a motion saying we want cameras in the courtroom, and we can talk more about what that motion looks like in a minute. And then Jack Smith's team saying, look, there's a federal rule. It says no cameras in the courtroom. There are no exceptions available. Therefore, Jack Smith's team has taken the position, no cameras in the courtroom. I happen to disagree with that. But at the moment, it looks like the most Judge Chutkan could do, if she believes cameras ought to be in the courtroom for some reason, she could basically issue an advisory opinion saying, listen, I think it makes sense, but Rule 53 prohibits it unless there is some exception that applies. So as of right now, it doesn't look like there is a significant chance we're going to see cameras in the courtroom.
Okay, I mean, there still does exist the possibility that we can see the rules changed, or that, you know, to your point, that the Supreme Court Justice John Roberts could come in and also issue some type of exception. So obviously we'll wait to see what movement we have there. But in the meantime, the DOJ, to your point, opposes this effort to televise the trial. Why is that?
I think they are sticking with the rule. They're sticking with tradition. You know, what I will say is, having been a federal prosecutor for decades and knowing lots and lots of people who are still at the Department of Justice, there are about 110,000 employees doing the hard work of the American people day in and day out. It's not a nimble group of prosecutors or people. Yeah. You know, they tend to like their norms and their traditions and their rules and their law and their precedent, and they stick with it. And they typically don't step outside of the box or kind of stray from the tried and true lane they have been in forever. But, you know, I have made the pitch over and over again that I think we should have cameras in the courtroom. Why? Because if we don't, a couple of things will happen. First of all, Donald Trump's lawyers, not to mention his lackeys and lapdogs and flunkies and sycophants, will step to the camera at the end of every trial day and lie to the American people. They will put disinformation out there into the public square saying, oh, if only you could have seen the horrible day that the prosecutors had in court, proving this whole thing is a witch hunt. It's election interference. Their case is falling apart. That will be untrue. But the problem is prosecutors are prohibited from speaking publicly about a trial while it is ongoing. So Jack Smith's team will say exactly nothing about what's going on in court. That's not exactly a fair fight in the court of public opinion. But then there's another fundamental reason. Just give me 2 minutes to lay this out, Brian, because I feel strongly about it.
Got it.
So Donald Trump, as we all know, is indicted on 4 separate charges. Count 4 is a conspiracy to deprive us of our voting rights. Because he's charged with a conspiracy to deprive the American people of their voting rights, guess what? The American voters are victims. There's a law on the books called the Crime Victims' Rights Act, for anyone scoring at home. It's 18 United States Code, Section 3771. And it says that victims may not be excluded from the courtroom. That's a federal law. Now, that law contemplates that the victims can't be physically kicked out of the courtroom. We have a right to see the trial on charges, you know, in which we are the victims. But I think it can extend to a situation here where if we don't have cameras in the courtroom, guess what? We are all being excluded from the courtroom because you can only pack about 100 spectators in a typical courtroom in DC federal court where this case is being tried. So I think there may be a viable legal challenge that could be filed saying, listen, we, the victims under the federal law, can't be excluded from the proceedings. We have a right to see these proceedings in real time. Therefore, we're demanding cameras in the courtroom. That would be something that, again, Judge Chutkan might be able to weigh in on with an advisory opinion. She probably couldn't grant it, but it's a vehicle that could put additional pressure on the U.S. Judicial Conference and on Chief Justice Roberts in favor of cameras in the courtroom.
Yeah, that's about as compelling a case as somebody could make. Glenn, the Trump team, by contrast, actually supports this move. Can you talk about the filing that his team submitted?
It is a 4.5-page motion. I don't often recommend to our viewers, Brian, that they read these motions by Donald Trump's defense lawyers. I would urge everybody to read this one. In my 30 years as a prosecutor, I wrote and I read more motions than I can ever count, than I can ever remember. This is not hyperbole. This 4.5-page motion by the defense might be the single most unprofessional, irresponsible, and embarrassing 4.5 pages I've ever read in a legal court filing. I pulled it up again, and let me just read a couple of sentences to give you the flavor of what Donald Trump and his lawyers put in this court filing. They say, aware that its charges are meritless, the prosecution has sought to proceed in secret, forcing the nation and the world to rely on biased secondhand accounts coming from the Biden administration and its media allies. So he asserts that Jack Smith and his team of federal prosecutors, quote, are aware that their charges are meritless. These are not just lies, they're damn lies. And it really is an embarrassment that this kind of propaganda makes its way into a court filing. Let me give you one more sentence. The Biden administration is unlawfully and unconstitutionally attempting to eliminate its leading political opponent. What a bunch of garbage. This 4.5-page motion is basically fact-free. It's legal precedent-free. They don't even cite case law supporting any of the positions they take. And it really reads like an unhinged 2 a.m. Donald Trump social media post, or maybe something that would have been drafted up by one of his PR flacks or an assistant campaign manager. I mean, it is a stone cold embarrassment.
Yeah, that sounds pretty on brand for Donald Trump and his team. Glenn, do you think that the Trump team actually wants this thing televised, or do they just think that it's so unlikely to happen that they're just pretending they do, and then when it inevitably gets denied, they can do their whole song and dance about how he's the victim of some massive persecution that even they don't want anybody to see?
Bingo. You put your finger right on it. It's the latter. They know that cameras are probably not going to be permitted in the courtroom. So what will they say? They'll say, you see, I wanted cameras in there just to show the kind of witch hunt that's being conducted by the Biden administration. Never mind its special counsel, right? Not under the control of either Merrick Garland or Joe Biden. But yeah, they're using this for PR value because they'll forever be able to say, you see, we wanted cameras in the courtroom and we were denied that right. So the wool's being pulled over the eyes of the American people. I don't think they want it. I think they just use this for PR value and as another vehicle to grift off of Donald Trump's base.
Yeah. Let's finish off with this. Glenn, why do you think that the court has an obligation to televise this trial? I know that you went through some of the legal avenues that they can use to kind of justify it, but what about their obligation to do so?
You know, I think there's an obligation to history. I think there's an obligation to the American people. I think there's an obligation, frankly, to the world, because this case has worldwide interest, to be able to see with our own eyes the evidence of Donald Trump's crimes, not just take second or third hand accounts. And let's face it, the greatest journalists in the world could cover this in real time and write about what's going on in that courtroom. How many people do you think will read and absorb all of that, as opposed to how many eyeballs do you think would be on a live stream of, for example, Vice President Mike Pence testifying about and against Donald Trump, the president he formerly served, or Bill Barr, the president's attorney general, testifying against Donald Trump about his democracy busting crimes on and around January 6th, his chief of staff testifying against him, Cassidy Hutchinson, Mark Meadows' chief of staff testifying against Donald Trump, and on and on and on. If ever it was important for history's sake for people to see this for themselves, it is in this trial.
It was perfectly put, so we'll leave it there. Obviously, when we have any update on whether this trial will be televised or not, we'll bring it to you. So if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.